material for aprons, neck cloths, handkerchiefs, that sort of thing. The cloth that they're using for most of their clothing, the majority of that is being imported. Some people estimate that only about 25% of the cloth used and consumed in America in the late 18th century was actually produced here, that most of it was coming from abroad. Living in a port like Bristol, you have access to shipping from all over the world. Our work here begins with what's left behind. That's really all we can look at as historians. We look at documents, written records, probate, inventories, court records, diaries, letters, reminiscences, things like that. We look at paintings and engravings and visual images that people left behind.
It's not a staid exhibit. It's not something that's just unmoving or anything, but to tell the stories. I like to tell the stories.
Yeah, we're not going to pull out everything every day as an exhibit. We really are doing these things that we need to do in order of priority and season. And we teach about the season that we're in right now.
If you come here in January or February, you'll find snow on most of the ground. You'll find us cutting a lot of wood and firewood and working on our buildings and repairing them and maintaining our tools and doing that kind of work, tending to our livestock. If you come here in the middle of summer, of course, we've got a garden that needs tending and weeding and planting. We've got work that goes on in the house.
And they'll walk in here and say, this is just like my grandmother's kitchen. This is like what it was in the Ukraine or in Portugal or in Hungary or some place where they've come. And, oh yes, my grandmother did this and we did that, and then we always went in the garden when we did that, and then we slaughtered a pig, it was like this, and you know, that's exciting to me because then I get to learn from them too.
In order to ensure that the food for the day would be on time, the first thing the farmer's wife had to do was to get the oven ready. She began by getting a fire started in the fireplace. Once the fire was going, she would remove some of the embers and place them into the oven, along with some kindling and small pieces of wood to restart a second fire. The oven was a dome-shaped masonry space built entirely of bricks. The fire was then allowed to burn until the entire oven was blackened.
And then you'll see sort of the slowing of the flames. They're still in there, it's still really warm, but the flames are sort of in slow motion. It's really neat. And at that point you can see the fire begin to change the interior of the oven from black to white. And I can see into it right now, and I can see that everything is white all over. And that's where we want the oven. And that's the point at which then you make sure that what's left of the fire is spread pretty much over the course of the floor of it.
At this point, the embers were removed and put back into the fireplace, and the oven was left to temper and lose its sharpest heat. After a short time, the oven was ready for baking.
And the heat really lasts a long time. You can probably fill the oven twice with loaves of bread, and there'll still be adequate heat to cook them through properly. Then when you've brought those out to cool, put in something that's going to take a long slow bake. You know, the famous Boston baked beans. You know, they can be mixed up. Any casserole type dish like that can be all mixed up. You have all your ingredients put together. And then that can go in the oven at the end of the day. After everything else is baked, the oven is much cooler. Put those in, close them out of the oven again, and take them out the next morning.
In this time period, bread and meat were the main staples of the farmer's diet, and they ate plenty of it.
This is a raised bread, so it has a lot of wheat flour, has some rye flour, and it has a bit of maize too, good white Rhode Island corn.
Most of the wheat products used at this time had to be imported and purchased, so adding native-grown corn really helped to stretch the wheat.
Which is also really good.
After the bread was kneaded, it was allowed to relax until the oven was ready.
So this was all mixed up this morning. Put some more water, some more flour, a little salt, but it's a very basic bread of the sort that had come out of England with people who settled in this area.
Imagine coming home after a hard day's work and biting into a slice of freshly baked bread covered with a generous amount of thick homemade butter. Who knows, on your next visit to Coggeshall, you may time it just right to get your own taste of history. Mowing fields on the farm was a labor-intensive job, and nothing like it is today. It was also a project that had to be done, and not for cosmetic reasons.
Yeah, when you have domesticated animals, obviously what they eat primarily is grass. And in the wintertime, obviously, there is no grass, so you've got to put up hay.
The mowing tool used at this time was called a scythe. It required some skill and a steady hand.
It needs to be quite sharp in order to effectively do anything. And in fact, it helps quite a bit if the grass is damp, because there's a little bit more weight to the grass, so there's more inertia in it. So when you slice at its base, it just falls right down.
The farmer usually did this mowing early in the morning while the dew was still on the grass. They would work in rows, each person a few steps behind the other. And once a rhythm was established, the work went rather quickly. The larger the field, the more people were needed to mow it in order to get it finished in a sensible amount of time. The grass was then allowed to dry or get made.
When the hay is made is when it's dry enough to take in. If it's too wet and you take it in, you can set your barn on fire. It'll spontaneously combust because as it breaks down, as it composts, it'll heat up sometimes to that amount that it can actually combust.
This was hard work, but every farmer knew the sharper the scythe, the easier the cut.
When the blade starts to dull a little bit, it's just a lot more effort, and sometimes you have to make 2 passes because it's not cutting the first stroke. So really you want to maintain it, because if it gets too dull, just like any other sharp tool, it takes longer to sharpen it. So if you do it just every once in a while, it's a quick thing, and you just, too wet is no let is a saying that I like a lot. And I find it's the same with relationships or anything else. Maintain it and it's a lot easier.
Of course, every farm in the 1790s had a garden that needed to be tended. This chore was relegated to the women of the household, leaving the men to do the harder work. So how well kept the garden was depended on how many women were in the family. The crops normally grown were any crops that could be put up over the winter.
They're growing large quantities of beets and onions and carrots and potatoes and turnips and parsnips, beans and peas and cabbages and things that they can store.
Even though tending the garden wasn't considered hard work, it was still time-consuming.
Mostly getting rid of the weeds.